We are talking today with Father John Deere. Father John Deere is an internationally known voice for peace and nonviolence. He is a longtime activist, popular lecturer, and movement organizer, and author-editor of 30 books, including Peace Behind Bars, a peacemaking priest's journey from jail, Transfiguration, a meditation on transforming ourselves and our world, Living Peace, a spirituality of contemplation and action, his autobiography, A Persistent Peace, One Man's Struggle for a Nonviolent World, and his latest book, The Nonviolent Life. And in 2008, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Father John Deere, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So start out, tell us what was your motivation in writing your latest book, The Nonviolent Life?
Well, I've been really passionate about nonviolence my whole life, been thinking about it and trying to practice it and study it for 35 years. And really studying Gandhi and King and organizing it. And, is Gandhi right? Does nonviolence work? Can we, use nonviolence to end oppression and war and disarm the planet? What does it mean? So I've talked to probably millions of people around the country and the world about nonviolence. It's like full time. It's an interesting experience, by the way, because that means every day I've got people telling me why they want to kill. Why? Anyway, so I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I wrote this book, which is the culmination of my life's work, to try to put in a nutshell what nonviolence means. So here's my thesis of the book. And this is based on extensive work with Gandhi and King, that nonviolence requires three simultaneous attributes or attitudes. First, you got to be nonviolent to yourself. You go, okay. Really, really lessen the violence within you and be really peaceful toward yourself and to make peace with yourself. While you're doing that, at the same time, second, you have to practice meticulous interpersonal nonviolence toward every human being on the planet and all creatures and all creation. I mean, right there, that's a mouthful. And while you're doing that at the same time, you also have to have one foot in the global grassroots movement of nonviolence, which is sweeping the world. There have been, some 85 nonviolent revolutions in the last 30 years. We now know 2/3 of the human race are personally involved today in local grassroots nonviolent movements for justice and peace. The world is moving, just not hearing about it in the United States. Now, I write it this way because I'm a lot of experience around the country and the world in the movement, and we're really good at one or two of those, but very few people go like Gandhi and Dr. King and do all three. In other words, there's a lot of church people I'm familiar with who are really nice. And they're nice to themselves and they're nice to their families, and that's not nonviolence. You also have to be part of the movement. On the other hand, there's a lot of us hardcore activists, and we're committed and we're really involved in the movement. And how shall I put this nonviolently? We're not really nice people, and we're full of violence, and we're not good in our relationships. Gandhi and King were working this out. And that's why ultimately it's way beyond a tactic or a strategy. It's a way of life, and it's a spirituality. It's a spiritual path. It's at the heart of every religion. And it means really cultivating peace within us, around us, and being part of the new, growing, global peace movement. This is the best thing we can do with our lives. I think this is what it means to be a human being, and that's what my new book is about.
It sounds like a pretty tall order for people to sign on to. Is there a specific one of those three that one starts with, or you just start with all three of them simultaneously?
I don't know. But, it's just that we've all failed teaching nonviolence. And we've had these great people, Gandhi and Dr. King. Every school on the planet should educate every child in the methodology of nonviolence, to be nonviolent to yourself and to your one another's. Every parent should be nonviolent. Every church, don't get me started, should be a training school of nonviolence. We totally failed at that. But violence isn't working. And war certainly isn't working, and the Trident submarine base here isn't working. It's not making anybody happier, by the way. It's not making us safer or secure. So I'm talking about it because our greatest people in the last century gave their lives to this vision. Gandhi, Dr. King, Dorothy Day, the Berrigans, Thomas Merton, and the living people, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, Mairead Maguire. That's all they're talking about. And I think all activists, all people of goodwill, all people of faith and conscience should just cut to the chase and say, this violence doesn't work. It's totally failed us. We have a very poor leadership in the United States at every level right now. Let's start grappling with these questions of nonviolence and teach it and practice it. So that's what I've been trying to do. And the group that I work with, Pace Bene, we're doing nonviolence trainings around the country, and we're organizing this project called Campaign Nonviolence, where we're looking towards, we're calling for hundreds of demonstrations around the country this fall under the banner of war, poverty, and environmental destruction. But in terms of the book, I just invite your listeners to reflect, on the violence within them and the violence in their life. And does it work? And is it, how can you become more and more nonviolent? How can we be nonviolent to ourselves? And, there's always a few people in our lives, personally and then globally, like the president or someone, who really push our buttons. In a strange way, they become our teachers because they show how violent we are. And that doesn't work, I'm arguing. So I invite us to reflect on our relationships. And then if you're not involved in the movement somehow or other, I always say everybody's got to get involved. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everybody can pick an issue, donate a little time, and be part of the movement. This is what it means to be human, but the world is in such bad shape. Now, I'm assuming lots of your listeners here in Seattle are involved, but that's why I say let's go deep like Gandhi and King and radiate personally, experience personally the peace we seek politically. I'm not sure, where you begin to do that. It needs prayer and reflection and study, ongoing meditation about your own life and the meaning of life. We only have so much time left on earth, everybody. Life is short. And what's the best thing we can do for peace? How can our lives really help sow seeds of peace and radiate peace and actually be part of disarming Seattle and the country and the world? These are the best things worth thinking about, and let's not listen to the TV or the politicians. This is the real stuff. This is what our great teachers would be saying if they were alive today, Gandhi and King. That's why I go around and talk about it, Mike.
So what do you propose for methodologies for people dealing with violence within themselves or towards themselves?
Right. Oh, I had this sad, long letter from a hardcore prisoner in California on Friday, and he wrote me that question because he read about me speaking in California. He said, my whole life I've been violent to myself. Well, I was beat up as a kid. I beat myself up. Then I joined the gang. Then I beat people up. Then I killed people. Now I'm beating people up in prison. How do I stop? And he goes, I'm so unhappy. It was so touching, I'm tired of being violent and violent to myself. Well, I think I say this, and I sound so stupid, and it's like fifth grade, I realize. It's the simplest thing in the world, and yet it's the hardest thing. And I can say this with some authority because of the Dalai Lama. He's now saying, when he comes to the States, you people are so sick. The people, we Americans, are so stooped in violence. It's like the air we breathe. But it's so internalized in us now. It's so beaten. We're all victims of violence, in our families and our youth, and then in the Vietnam War and racism. It's just all we know. And he's saying there's very low self-esteem. There's a great self-hatred among us. And that makes sense. And I think there's a connection, a line between that and the Trident submarine at Bangor. So I like what Thich Nhat Hanh says. Just look deeply within. Don't beat yourself up, like, okay, how am I feeling? What's going on? I'm so mad at myself. I shouldn't have done that thing yesterday. And then you beat yourself up a second time because you did that. You're continuing the cycle of violence. No, take a deep breath and move on to a second thought and go, okay, well, I did that because of this. I'm talking about really conscious living and awareness of what's going on inside us, of the roots of war within us. And then you end up having to have some kind of a spiritual practice of silence and meditation and contemplation every day. All the greatest peacemakers in history insisted on that. Because when you begin to slow down, all that junk comes up, and you have to look at it, and then you can let it go. And keep letting go of your anger and your hurts and your wounds and your bitterness. Forgive everyone who ever hurt you, and receive the gift of peace. As a Christian, I'd say from Jesus, or, could say from the God of peace. But I think, the Buddhists speak of just sitting in peace. So, and humanists, and so it's a path toward a life of inner peace, but it requires constant attention. It's a daily inner work. If you're going to stand up and face war, you have to be doing a lot more inner work to strengthen your inner peace, it seems to me.
Do you see anger and violence as pretty much the same thing?
This is a big question. I could talk for an hour. And I have a whole chapter on that in the book. And now, did you know, I'm a big name dropper. Mahatma Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount every day for 45 years, Mike. Mahatma Gandhi read from the Sermon on the Mount every morning, every evening for 45 years. Nobody reads the Sermon on the Mount. He's not even a Christian. So I've started to read the Sermon on the Mount. He says the greatest teachings of nonviolence in history. I think he's right. And you go and you read it, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It's where all the teachings of Jesus are. Blessed are the peacemakers. Offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. There it is. Love your enemies. Be as compassionate as God. There are these 6 teachings that lead up to love your enemies. You have heard it said, but I say to you, love your enemies. The first one is, it's so politically incorrect. This is Jesus. I'm blaming the nonviolent Jesus. You have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. I say, don't even get angry. When you feel that, remember the people who have been hurt by you and go and be reconciled with them. Now, what if Jesus knew something about nonviolence? I'm just proposing that. I know that's scandalous. Gandhi decided to take him seriously with that and experimented with him. The week he was killed, he said the greatest thing he ever did in his life was learn to conserve his anger instead of lashing out. Because it's from wounds. You're hurt, especially if you're involved in the movement. You're going to be hurt every day. And instead of acting on that through violence, you channel it into some positive action for the good. And Gandhi was saying, and I write about this, I call it the emotional life of nonviolence. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, avoid these 2 emotions. They will not help you for the long haul of peacemaking, anger and fear. And we have a lot of angry activists and a lot of fearful people. But there's 2 emotions there that Jesus recommends that nobody in the United States has. I mean, in the movement. I'm just being dramatic, but grief and joy. And that's it. If you're an activist, you care for the world. I mean, we've killed 1.5 million Iraqis the last 20 years. These are sisters and brothers. There's 1 billion people starving to death today, according to the United Nations. 25 wars. We're grieving. We should take time to grieve, and we should also cultivate joy, which is different than happiness. Gandhi did all of that. And so he's trying to figure out what is a nonviolent life. I was mentioning I was just spent a month in South Africa, and I've had a great day with Archbishop Tutu, and I write about him in the book. That guy's 82. He's been under death threat since he was 13, and he's embarrassing. He should almost not be allowed out in public because he's like a little kid. He laughs all the time, and he cries all the time. We talked about this too. He's not angry, and he's changing the world. I mean, he was off to Iran the day after I was with him. Bono says he's the most important prophet of justice and peace alive right now, and I think that's true. I want to be like that. I think Gandhi was right, saying that Jesus was right, that anger's not a good motive for the rest of our lives to work for peace and justice. Then we live our whole life as raging lunatics or terrified people. No, but you can grieve. And you can rejoice, and then we go forward working for peace and justice, things like that.
I think those have actually been found healthy for you, whereas anger causes numerous physical maladies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We could talk a lot about that, too. I mean, it doesn't hit the effects of it, but...
So you were talking about your campaign Nonviolence
Yeah.
and teachings around the country.
Right.
Is that right? Is that something that's going to be addressed in those teachings?
Yeah, well, see, one of the things that we need right now in the States is we need to train people in the methodology of nonviolence. And if you're an activist and you've never done a nonviolence training, you've got to go and spend some weekend with some experienced trainer. I mean, how do you, so that we can stand up to the police and respond nonviolently, or our family or the church or somebody, and then we really have to train ourselves. We have to practice. Gandhi was doing this in his community every day for 40 years. I'm just proposing to take a weekend, which is silly almost. You have to constantly be training. So there's lots of good groups doing that. The group I work with, Pace Bene, which is at pacebene.org, or campaignonviolence.org, does nonviolence trainings. You could bring them in. Folks could bring them into Seattle. And we're doing study groups around my book, The Nonviolent Life. But we have called upon all the peace and justice groups of the country, locally, regionally, and nationally, to gear up again, because everybody's so beat up and burnt out, with using the congressional elections this fall, given all the horrors of the world, starting on September 21st, which is International Peace Day, to take to the streets, ideally to go to your local congressional representative's office. And what we're asking for people, and we're working really hard on this, and it's going to take off in Seattle too, I hope, is to pick the issues that you're passionate about. And don't wait for somebody else to organize it. Go and organize it yourself. Under war, for example, drones. A lot of people are going to be protesting drones. Poverty. A lot of people. I've just spent 2 weeks in California working on immigration and prison and the executions and so forth and so on. But global hunger and poverty is getting much worse. And then, of course, the environment. So, or the environment. We're working with 350.org and other groups to take to the streets. And nonviolence ultimately has to be practiced in public, in the streets, in a spirit of peace, saying, no, no, no. We don't want all this money for war. We don't want these drones dropping bombs on people. We don't want the nuclear weapons at the Trident submarine base. We want funding for schools and poor people and healthcare. And meanwhile, we want to clean up this environment. Things like that. We need to, change always happens from bottom-up grassroots movement building. And I'm just saying, my friends and I are really organizing to try to reignite the movement. And people can go to our website, campaignonviolence.org, to get involved.
Talk about why it's important for people to take to the streets as opposed to just clicking on like on Facebook.
It's a very serious question, actually. And a lot of people say, well, the internet and Facebook and Twitter were the key of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. If so, great. I spent a serious time in Cairo the year before the Arab Spring broke there, and I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm not so sure. There is a lot of serious organizers like us who just keep at it, and then you never know how the movement is going to take off, what the moment would be. If you study movements and how change actually happens. Well, I'm a name dropper, so I'm going to mention another name. Cesar Chavez, the great famous organizer in California. I spent an evening with him shortly before he died. And we talked about this. And I said to him, if I am ever asked, what do we do? How do you work for peace and justice? What should I say? And he got very animated, and he started pounding his fist, and he said, you tell everyone for the rest of your life, public action, public action, public action. Now, that was a great answer. Everybody has to stand up publicly and take some action for justice and peace. You can't just write letters or give speeches or read books or like on Facebook. All of that's good. But we need a movement. And the world is marching. The people in the United States need to start marching too, because we're causing all this death and destruction around the planet, and it's destroying our own selves too. And many of us have to be full-time committed in this. And Seattle is such an important place. You've been such leaders for the country, especially under the WTO protests years ago. Well, that needs to continue. And we're just offering, here's a way that people can get involved this fall through Campaign Nonviolence. I'm just a big believer in organizing demonstrations because I see, and they have to be meticulously nonviolent, but that's how the change happens. It's a very strange thing, and I've been studying a lot, whether it's Jesus on the cross to Gandhi, there's something about publicly seeking the truth without violence, and yet being willing to take on violence, to suffer in love with others, while we still insist on the truth of our common unity and justice and peace. Then when you move into that thing, people getting arrested or people giving their lives for justice and peace, it taps into the human heart. That's way beyond Facebook. And this is what the organizing for, but then nonviolence can become contagious. And you can look at this. This is certainly the story of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, those moments. And that's what we need to happen now. And this is just experimenting with truth and love. Anyway, things like that.
So how do you support a nonviolent movement in a situation, let's say, it's not that bad here in the U.S. currently, but let's say like in El Salvador when Arena had the death squads, and at the time when the Jesuit priests and nuns were like brutally murdered.
I moved there. That's what I did because I was very passionate about El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala in the early 80s. So it took me 3 years, and I moved to El Salvador, and I spent about 5 months there under the tutelage of the 6 Jesuits who were later assassinated. They were my friends. It's a very powerful thing to have known great martyrs. They put us all to shame. I mean, those guys were getting 15 death threats a week in the 7 years before I met them in 1985. Their houses had been bombed 21 times. The university, imagine Seattle University being bombed repeatedly because they're trying to get rid of the Trident submarine base at Bangor. It was as simple as that. And the government would be bombing Seattle University. It's so hard. I think about it all the time because we have nothing like that. Well, they sent me out to a refugee camp in the middle of the jungle where the U.S. was bombing. The bombs were falling around. They had 1,000 people. They had all lost all their loved ones. They ran out the back doors. The death squads ran through the front door and killed everybody. The theory was when the death squads came into the camp, I would go out and greet them, and they wouldn't be killed because the white gringo was there. I was 22, and talk about working through your nonviolence, Here comes, and they were all kids, the death squads with machine guns, and they come up, ready to kill. And I go, hi, and the goofier you are, the better, I figured. I'm just a dumb American, hi, can I help you? You need anything? And they walk away because you can't work with a goofball like that. The creativity and humor of nonviolence. Learned a lot, and then came very involved in the struggle here in the U.S., organizing many demonstrations, getting arrested a lot, going to jail a lot. We went on a 21-day fast, several Jesuit priests and several Salvadoran refugee women, excuse me. And we built a movement. I think it was one of the strongest in the country in the last 40 years. And we cut military aid to El Salvador, and the war ended. So I've seen it work. But you just have to get involved. Since you asked, it's a very personal question to me.
Right.
So with any issue, I've lived in Northern Ireland. I've spent a lot of time in Palestine. I went to Afghanistan last year. Maybe I can do that because I know how to do that. But not everybody has to do that. But everybody has to get involved with the movement building. That's the key thing. And it just means local peace and justice groups here in Seattle. So important. Get together with friends. Figure out what's going on. Bring in speakers. Take to the streets, organize politically, and say no to this culture of war and violence.
So part of that, though, was effective because of your white privilege and connection to the U.S. What about the peasants there who were facing those same death squads?
Why
not take up arms? You know what I mean?
I had that conversation with 1,000 people, and the Jesuits who were my friends, and they used to all laugh at me because I was talking then as a kid the way I'm talking to you this same minute. Nothing has changed. If they were alive, they'd be rolling their eyes. But they never heard it before. You know, Romero was just beginning. He didn't really use the word nonviolence, and the situation was so evil. But we funded all the killings. I mean, the death squad government couldn't have done anything without the money from the United States. It's the same with the occupation of the Palestinians. Everything is happening here. So when I start very gently, and I didn't, they usually would come up because I had already been arrested a lot with the campesinos in the refugee camp. They'd start, well, what do you do? Well, I'm involved in movements and so forth. And we get into nonviolence. They go, I'm totally with you. Help us. We don't want to kill anybody, and we don't want to be killed. They were sick of death. That's my experience around the whole world. And all the war zones I've been in a lot. Everybody is for it. I could tell you stories you wouldn't believe. So no, that's not the issue. But I do remember the Jesuits who were killed telling me I wanted to stay there and live there for the rest of my life. And they said, no, you need to go back to the United States and work to end all the war making and the military spending, the funding of all the wars around the world, which are killing us. And he goes, hey, Korea, your job is going to be harder. They're just going to kill us. They're going to ignore you. But you've got to keep at it and keep talking about it and keep building a movement. And that's why I'm here with you today, Mike.
So do you have an idea how to pull people who were formerly activists back into, let's call it the activist fold? For instance, when I got involved 25, 30 years ago with Central American issues, a lot of those people who were key leaders in that movement then are off raising families and don't appear to be involved anymore. And it seems really important to me to get them back involved if we're really going to succeed.
Well, I don't know about the word succeed, but other than that, I agree with your question. I'm trying to make you laugh, Mike. I'm quite serious, actually, about that. Succeed is not a word I ever use. You know, Mother Teresa said, it sounds goofy, but we're called to be faithful, not successful. And the outcome, and this is really spiritual talk, but it's also movement talk, is really out of our hands. However, what we need are committed people. We need people to really be involved for the long haul in the struggle for justice and peace. And I mean, that's the myth of the 60s, that people got really involved in fighting the Vietnam War, totally burned out. That's why I wrote this book the way I did, about your inner work as well as the public work and your relationships. It's all one. This is a holistic view of peace and nonviolence. Gandhi was very clear about, not to mention Jesus and Buddha, about modeling the new world we want to see in our hearts and our personal lives and so forth. Very hard. And I was very involved in Central America too, and you see people. It was very interesting. I often ask why, and I think it's because we were just geographically close to Central America and what Reagan was saying. Like, why isn't everybody equally involved in Afghanistan right now? Or Iraq? I've been to both places. But I invite people to get involved, especially people who know well, because the world is in really serious shape. I mean, there's 25 wars happening, 3 to 4 billion people in subhuman conditions, 15 to 20,000 nuclear weapons, catastrophic climate change bearing down upon us, and all the other forms of violence. And it's not going to change. We don't have any leadership. You know, the United States is not going to lead the way toward nonviolence. Change only happens from the grassroots, bottom-up movement building. And so we all need to be involved. And as I said, I was just with Archbishop Tutu, and he said something so powerful. It was so beautiful to see. I mean, he'd been under constant death threat his whole life. Risked his life over and over, kept speaking out against apartheid. Now he's been speaking out against every injustice in the world. And he's laughing and carrying on, but he's really serious at the same time. One of the first things he said to me when we met in Cape Town a few weeks ago was, we can never give up the struggle for justice and peace until the day we die. We have to be about this. And it's almost as I was saying, why? He said, because our sisters and brothers around the planet are suffering and dying. I mean, if you care, if you love the human race, and if you love creation, you have to get involved. So I appeal to everybody in your better nature to care and to be a person of love and compassion for all suffering people on the planet and for creation, and turn off the TV and stop reading the bad news and start going to meetings and start organizing and start helping to take to the streets to rebuild the movement. This is what we need, and this is how change comes. It's in that ordinary day-to-day stuff. Can I tell you another story? My friend also was Howard Zinn, the great writer of People's History of the United States, and he was in Santa Fe shortly before he died, and we had lunch, and he said this incredible thing. I've spent my whole life studying the movements for social change. Now, this is serious coming from Howard Zinn. The abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement from the 30s, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And he says, I finally realized that all of them have one thing in common. From the beginning to the middle, right to the very end, all the movements in our own history were hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. I said, that's really encouraging. And he goes, but then there was this breakthrough of hope. And I asked myself, why? And he said, I realized they had one other thing in common. They were all made up of ordinary people who kept at it, doing one or two or three things every day for their struggle for justice and peace, even though they knew they were never going to live to see the outcome they were giving their lives for. You do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. It's the best thing you can do with your life. And then the change is inevitable. It's going to happen. This is how this movement building of nonviolence and always, always, always works, Gandhi said. It's just rarely tried. We're experts at violence. I found that very, very helpful. And that's why I say, you don't have to do everything, but I encourage everybody to get back involved and to pick one issue and to do their part, to help continuing the movement to grow. And, I think we're headed for bad days. This country's going to collapse economically. It cannot sustain itself like this. We have all these nuclear weapons. We're going to use them unless we, the people, say no. And we're killing people all over the planet. And that's why we have to keep at this movement building. And Seattle is a really, really, really important place in this country. And I know I travel full time. And so it's tempting to sit back, and go, well, I did my part, and life is good, and like Seattle, and I can just check out on the internet. No, you gotta give a little bit, and it's going to be inconvenient and risky, and go to meetings and do the legwork and that kind of thing. That's what we need more and more people to be doing, things like that.
You're based out of New Mexico.
At the moment.
How did you choose that spot?
That's a long, sad story. I'm trying to make you laugh, but I was living in New York City with Daniel Berrigan in the Jesuit community, and had been the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the largest interfaith peace group in the world. You're very active in Seattle, too, I know. That's why I've been out here a lot. And I just stepped down as director, and September 11th happened, and I became the coordinator for the Red Cross of all the chaplains, working with the families and working at Ground Zero. And that was really powerful. Excuse me. Meanwhile, we were organizing demonstrations in Times Square against the bombing of Afghanistan. Now, for me, this was a holistic Christian response. Love your neighbor and love your enemies. Show compassion at home and abroad. There was a lot of publicity about me in the New York Times and elsewhere, and I got called in, and church officials kicked me out of New York. Yeah. This is good. I'm fulfilling my job description, Mike, because Jesus got killed. So I just figure if you're not in trouble, then you're not following Jesus. But if you're in trouble, things are going well. So I moved to New Mexico, the poorest state in the country. Did you know that, Mike? Yeah. Number one in poverty. Number one in military spending. Number one in nuclear weapons. We think there's some 2,000 to 3,000 nuclear weapons at the Albuquerque Airport, more than any other place on the planet, maybe a city in the very north of Russia. Number one in drunk driving, number one in suicide, number one in what? Domestic violence, number one in alcoholism. I was just reading yesterday the village area, well, in northern New Mexico, there's more violence and poverty than any place in the country. Hands down. We just got to number one in child hunger, right, again. We surpassed Mississippi after Katrina. But at Los Alamos, the mountain up in the north, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, there are more millionaires and PhDs than any other place on the planet. And business is booming. Obama is trying to rebuild it. Obama has done more for nuclear weapons than anybody since Ronald Reagan in 1983. All my friends have studied the fine print and the money. We know this. And by the way, they're dumping radioactive waste off the mountain down on top of the pueblos, the indigenous people. The land is poisoned. Where I live, which is in view of Los Alamos, I can't drink the water from the well. I have a cat. If she drinks the water, she'll die because it has stuff in it. So I went there deliberately. I thought this was what Gandhi would do. The poorest place and nuclear weapons. And I was a pastor of 5 churches there. And we've been organizing, annual peace vigils at Los Alamos. We're going to have another one coming up this August to commemorate Hiroshima. What do you do? How do you engage in nonviolence in such a place? And until I was there, there'd been, we think, only 2 or 3 demonstrations at Los Alamos ever. Who cares about Los Alamos? And yet, business is booming. They are continuing to build new nuclear weapons there. Obama's trying to build this new state-of-the-art plutonium bomb factory. So evil. Anyway, our little church group got out the Bible. I mean, this would be like a great sitcom if it weren't so serious. I mean, we're like the Marx Brothers or Seinfeld trying to take on nuclear weapons. That's the peace movement in my... But we have to do it anyway. And we came onto the book of Jonah. Remember him, and he walked through the town of Nineveh and called them to repent, and they put on sackcloth and ashes and all repented. It's the oldest ancient biblical symbol of protest in human history. So for the 60th anniversary of Hiroshima, like 500 of us went up the mountain. We formed the Sackcloth and Ashes Subcommittee. And that's hard work to make. We made 500 pieces of sackcloth, small, medium, and large. 500 bags of ashes. I mean, how do you do this? And so we did it. And we gathered. We had a prayer. We walked like Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. King silently took over the entire town and synchronized our watches, 500 people. And right at the moment, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon on the 60th anniversary of Hiroshima, we poured ashes all over the streets of Los Alamos. We put on the sackcloth, a 3,000-year-old form of protest, and we sat down for 30 minutes of strict silence. As I instructed everybody, we're trying to do this in Gandhian Satyagraha, to repent of the mortal sin of war and nuclear weapons, and beg the God of peace for the gift of disarmament. And at 30 minutes, we came back to the pond where they actually build the fat boy, the actual bomb from Hiroshima. This is an actual place. And I've been to 1,000 demonstrations. The only one in my whole life. Every single person came back crying. We were all utterly overwhelmed. Because we didn't go in pointing our fingers. That doesn't do any good. Or yelling or screaming. We actually need these people. They're the only ones who know how to dismantle the darn things. But we were taking responsibility too. And Gandhi talked about the importance of a symbol. Ashes, Hiroshima. Anyway, everybody was very powerfully moved. And we've been doing that every year since then. And it was big news. And I've gotten in a lot of trouble, lots of trouble, because of that. We didn't have to say much, but there we were on the TV and the front page, and everybody gets it. You're going to Los Alamos, and you're sitting in sackcloth and ashes, and you're repenting on the Hiroshima day that something's going on. Because all those good people, 20,000 people, most of them are Christians, and they spend their lives building nuclear weapons, just serving death. And we all have to stand up some way and say no to this. So that's why I went to New Mexico, and why I'm still involved there. And that's just what I personally have been doing for peace, besides the national and international speaking and writing.
Did you say you believe there's thousands of warheads at Albuquerque Airport?
Right. And you can, I just flew there this morning. It's very hard to see it. It takes years of training, and you would know it, and you wouldn't even know it, how they did it, because it's the desert, just on the edge of Albuquerque. Now, I'm not sure of the number. Nobody really knows. It could be 1,900 or 2,500 or 2,800 nuclear warheads. And there are these little, phone booths that looks like in the desert with a dirt trail. As you can only see it as the plane takes off, and you're looking down. It's part of the Kirkland Air Force Base and Sandia National Labs, which is connected to Los Alamos. So when they bring them, the heart of the nuclear bomb, that's a bad way to phrase it, but the core pit of the nuclear bomb down from, which is what is made up at Los Alamos, they bring that down. They actually used to drive that through Santa Fe. And they still do. It flies off, or they store it there. So a lot of my friends, the full-time activists, have studied those places, and you can see them from the air. But as Daniel Berrigan always says, the bomb covers its tracks. It's everywhere. Death as a methodology is just so normal now, that it's normal to have thousands of nuclear weapons at the Albuquerque Airport, or might I suggest, here in Seattle. The end of the world is around here. This is our humanity at question, at stake here, our spiritual lives. That's why everybody has to stand up. And the only way to do that is to be really centered in peace, because it's so hard and it's so disturbing. And you can move into despair or numbness, or give up, be involved in the movement, because there's so little hope. No, there is hope. We have a power. We're not powerless. We can change things if we want to. Do we want to? I'm saying let's do it.
You've said a couple times that the different actions you've taken have gotten you in big trouble. Who did they get you in big trouble from?
Everybody. I'm banned from pretty much every military base in the United States. I think that includes Bangor. I was there in the 80s. I'm pretty sure I was arrested. I can't even remember now. I've been arrested about 80 or 90 times. So that had meant my first arrest at the Pentagon to my last arrest was at the Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, which is the headquarters of the drones, and we were the first group to protest the drones. But literally I've been arrested all over the country, in nonviolent, peaceful, civil disobedience. And then, studying Gandhi, he says you try everything you can to work for peace and justice, everything legal. You speak, you write, you organize, you preach, you pray, you fast, you vigil. We've done all of that. I've been doing it till my blue in the face. This is my 30th book, and I'm still speaking. But he says at some point you have to cross the line, which legalizes mass murder in our names, and break the laws, and accept the consequences. And that's why, I got involved. My most notorious crime was with Philip Berrigan in December 1993 when we walked onto the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina. It's one of the largest Air Force bases in the country. This is 1993. They had the F-15E, which carries nuclear bombs. They were on alert to bomb Bosnia. And what do? It was 4 a.m. There were 4 of us. It's an enormous place, like the size of Rhode Island, as far as I can tell. It's some huge thing. We walked through the woods in the back, and there was a sign that said, "Trespassers will be shot on sight." And we kept walking, and we walked through the woods, and then we came on the Air Force Base. It was like 3 Seattle airports with tens of thousands of soldiers at 4 a.m., 75 of these massive fighter bombers. We walked up to one of them. We each pulled out a hammer, and I went up to the side and hammered once on the fighter bomber. And for that act, I faced 20 years in prison. I did almost a year, like 10 months in jail and then a couple years under house arrest. I can never vote again. I can't travel to several countries. I'm highly monitored by the government. I'm considered as high up a terrorist as you can get by the United States government. I recently was visiting with Julian Assange, who's a friend of mine, and he said, things have changed since 1993 in terms of the surveillance and the monitoring and what's happening to the government. And I'm talking about, you're talking about the effects that I feel. I really feel that. Julian says the United States is moving into global totalitarianism. So he's trying to use language to talk about what's happened to our country as we've left democracy. I mean, that we have these tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, for example, can survey every human being on the planet. They're monitoring all of us. There's no more privacy. We're losing all our civil liberties. And so this is beyond empire, global totalitarianism. Well, I keep talking about getting involved with the movement because we're like Nazi Germany in the 1920s or in the early 30s right now. And we're going to wake up one day and some of us will be carted off to prison for life, the leaders, and we will have lost all our liberties. Things can move fast if things happen, and with catastrophic climate change and the loss of fossil fuels, things are going to change in this world. We need movements, I keep saying, to resist and to defend our rights and the rights of our sisters and brothers around the world. But as that action, though, I always joke, I said to the judge, when I hammered on the nuclear fighter bomber, Your Honor, I said, I'm trying to make you laugh here, Mike. I'm just doing what it said in the Bible. I'm just a young priest. And you know the Bible, Your Honor, and the prophet Isaiah said someday these people are going to come along and beat their swords into plowshares, and then the world will never study war anymore. And then I said, and Your Honor, I'm just trying to follow Jesus, who said, love your enemies, don't nuke them. And I was joking. That's the actual translation from the original Greek. And that didn't go over very well with the judge, but you see my point. What if we actually did these great things? And, part of it, since we had talked earlier about me knowing the 6 Jesuits killed in El Salvador. I mean, they gave their lives. They were talking about it with me all the time. It's a matter of time before they're going to get killed. And I was scared to death being around them. There's nothing to describe what these heroic people were like. And then I came and did this action with Philip Berrigan, and I thought, wow, maybe you can engage in that same kind of heroic faith. It's beyond courage. It's not courage. It's faith and giving your life and letting the chips fall. This is the way Gandhi talked. And what do we do with nuclear weapons? Somehow we have to engage the law, which legalizes them, and get into the courts. And that's what Ground Zero's tried to do for decades here at Bangor, which is so important. We have to keep that movement going. And speaking out, engaging in civil disobedience, peacefully, prayerfully, nonviolently, and saying no. And what will happen is one day we'll wake up and there'll be no more nuclear weapons. If people continue to build this movement, they'll just quietly be outlawed. But it's this long-haul quiet suffering of us involved now which history won't know about. This is how change happens. And these are very interesting questions. I don't know how I got into all that, but thanks for listening, Mike.
So how do you overcome your, maybe you don't have it, but how do you overcome your fear in these situations and, translate that for the average person that's going to stick their neck out? We had a local treasure here, Sister Jackie Hudson, who used to repeat the line that we need to learn to take one step out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, she's great. Well, a couple of things. It's very important. Now, I'm coming as a Christian, and I'm looking at this question of activism and movement building and working for justice and peace through the eyes of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, the Berrigans, Dorothy Day, and all these great people to understand Jesus. Well, the one thing you read, so I recommend, for those who are Christian, only read the 4 Gospels for the next 30 years and then get back to me. Gandhi's reading them. He's saying this is the most active nonviolence in the history of the world. And what's the one thing Jesus, and what if he's like Gandhi? Jesus, to my mind, is like Gandhi and Dr. King. What's the one thing he says more than anything else? 15 times, do not be afraid. So you have to start working on that. When I was a kid, we were professing vows in our religious life, and I was studying Gandhi, later wrote a book on Gandhi. Gandhi professed 16 vows when he got involved. We were professing 3. And so my friends and I professed a vow of nonviolence, as Gandhi did. But I didn't go the rest of them. And one of them, Gandhi also professed, was a vow of fearlessness. And Gandhi said, you cannot practice nonviolence if you're afraid. And Jesus in the New Testament talks about fear is the opposite of love. These are deep questions. Maybe indifference could be the opposite of love. But the scriptures speak of fear. And so how do you do that? Practice, practice, practice. You need friends. You need to pray and do your inner work, meditation. What are you afraid of? And then you take small steps. You can't go right into the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base for El Salvador. There's 1,000 small steps I made. I'm still making small steps, and I'm not saying I'm not afraid. I'm saying I'm working on it. And that's good. I don't want to spend my life in fear, nor do I want to spend it in anger or hatred or bitterness or despair. That's no good. And I'm watching Archbishop Tutu having a good time, and he's changing the world. That's what I want. And I've seen that with Daniel Berrigan. And, forgive me for being a name dropper too, but Joan Baez says Dr. King was the funniest person she ever knew. You don't think of Martin Luther King as a funny guy, but it makes sense to me with the great activists. They're full of life and humor. And they're not afraid. King doesn't ever look afraid. Well, he dealt with it early on, and he kept at it. He had friends and support, and he kept confronting his fears. So, so I do a lot of journaling. I used to, especially on this question of fear. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of flying. I'm afraid of public speaking. I picked the wrong career choice because I've given a million speeches. But, okay. So I don't let it stop me. I don't like to get arrested. It's always scary. I don't like going to jail. Last time I was in jail in Las Vegas was really scary. I mean, you couldn't. If I told you what it was like, you wouldn't believe it. Well, there's really no way to describe what it's like. I'm afraid of death, and ultimately our fear is death. And I'm professing to be a Christian, that God is infinitely nonviolent, wildly in love with me and every human being on the planet. It's like, I love you so much. And we're like, oh, leave me alone. But what if, like from Jesus to Gandhi, I said, okay, and live in faith and let God love me, and did my work and receive the gift of peace and walk with my friends, the Berrigans and others, onto these bases. Your fear lessens. It goes down. But you have to be doing these things. And you find that this is the spiritual question then. How deep do you want to go in love, and compassion, and peace, and nonviolence? You can let it all go. And you realize our survival is already guaranteed. Already guaranteed. And you can be like Martin Luther King. You can stand on the Lorraine Motel balcony. You could make fun of me. You could harass me. You could persecute me. You could arrest me. You could kill me. But we're all going to a new world of nonviolence. This is going to win out. So for me, it's really about a faith question. And it's a spiritual practice. And these are beautiful ways. This is just how I do it. And I see the great Christian teachers. I just led a retreat with Buddhists, Roshi Joan Halifax in Santa Fe. They would put it in different language, but she was talking about being a bodhisattva. Well, if you're a bodhisattva who's given your life for suffering humanity, you're not letting fear rule you. So we have to do our inner work. That's why I speak in my book, The Nonviolent Life, that nonviolence requires all three: the inner work, your relationships to all humanity and all creatures in creation, and third, being part of the movement at the same time. You can't pick one of those. And we often think, well, anyway, yeah.
In addition to your latest book, The Nonviolent Life, what other resources do you recommend people check out? Websites for the campaign Nonviolence?
Right. Thank you. So campaignonviolence.org. The little group that I'm part of is called Pace e Bene, which is an Italian phrase that St. Francis used to go around saying, Pace e Bene, peace and goodness. And they stoned him. Nobody really knows that, but that's PACEEBENE.org. My website is johndeere.org, JOHNDEA.org. I really appreciate it if people got my book, The Nonviolent Life, which is on Amazon, and my other books as well. In general, I always urge people to read Gandhi and Dr. King. And there's these thousands of books that have come out in the last 20 years on nonviolence, how it works, nonviolent victories throughout history, especially the last century, even when it was used against the Nazis, to all these revolutions, up to, wow, what happened in Liberia a few years ago. I think the greatest peacemaker is Lima Gabowi, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. You know, Charles Taylor killed 200,000 people, and she just called all the women to sit down in the streets and say, that's it, we've had enough. So he left. I mean, this works if you can organize it. And we need to study it. People are using it around the world. Study the movements. Study nonviolence. Our little group has a great program called Engage. You can buy the training manual. You can use it for yourself. You can have a group use it for a weekend, or it's broken down into 10 sessions, like over a semester. I think it's the best thing on training yourself and others in nonviolence. But there's lots of great resources. And you have to be doing your studying, and you have to be teaching and then organizing, things like that.
And are those resources available through your website?
Yeah, and through Pace Bene and Campaign Nonviolence.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, we are fortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. All the best to you and everybody listening.